Um, Christina and I'll keep this short because we want to have lots of discussion among everybody here about the state of our world at this point. But I thought I'd quickly present the Anthropocene, what it's about for those that aren't really familiar with it, and more importantly for this discussion, the naming of the Anthropocene and or non-naming, if you will, of the Anthropocene, and how the heck did that happen? So let's start with the history of the Anthropocene. The term itself was coined by Nobel laureate Paul Crutzen, who was at a meeting of my old organization, the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, IGBP. And Paul and everybody else that I've talked to who was at the meeting said that there was a presentation by the project that looked into paleo science that was part of IGBP, and they were talking about the Holocene and the Holocene, and Crutzen started squirming in his chair and finally got up and he said, "We're not in the Holocene anymore. We're in the Anthropocene." And everyone at the meeting said, after he said that, everybody stopped and there was silence in the room. And then it started bubbling up and lots of discussion and whatnot. So that was kind of an anecdotal exposure of the term itself. But where does it come from? Well, the genesis really involves this IGBP, the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, and Will Steffen, a colleague who unfortunately passed away last year. But Will and colleagues were looking at lots of different things, and this plot here shows all kinds of different parameters. The orangish ones are labeled socioeconomic trends in this particular depiction. The bluish ones are Earth system trends. And you can see on the left-hand side, the socioeconomic ones, you've got population growing, and there was an inflection point in population growth right around 1950. Primary energy use, fertilizer consumption, paper production, whatever you looked at, there was this great acceleration, as Will and company called it, right around the end of the
Om du
second
okej med
World
dig? Jag ska
War.
delta i en seminar som håller på i 20 minuter. Okej, jag bara går
It's Alistair.
bredvid dig då.
Hi, Alistair. But you can see the same thing happening in Earth system trends like carbon dioxide, nitrogen being transported to the coastal zone. And so there was this change in state, if you will, of the Earth system that was observed right around 1950. And John Foley and colleagues have a depiction of what the Anthropocene might look like. And John was writing about the Paleo-Anthropocene. So here on this image, you're seeing time since the planet was formed 4,567 million years ago. And there was a long time before humans showed up. Early hominids showed up roughly about 1 million years ago, but we didn't really have any particularly large influence on the Earth system, not until recently, less than 100 years ago or so. You can see here in this depiction the Industrial Revolution, and still that was a bit of a lag time before our influence, we humans' influence on the planet really changed substantially. So what would a start of the Anthropocene look like? What kind of things would you try to gauge this turning point or tipping point, if you will, by? And here is one of the papers that is included in the documentation that was supporting the proposal to call the Anthropocene a new epoch. And let's just look at the table quickly. I don't want to go through the whole thing here, but to the very left, you can see different kinds of events like megafauna extinction, the origin of farming, the Industrial Revolution, and the dates at which those events happen. And then almost all the way to the right, the potential GSSP date, golden spike date, is the column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And here, for instance, if we look at megafauna extinction, we know from records that whenever we new modern humans migrated to a new area, the large fauna, the megafauna, disappeared relatively quickly after we got there. But what you can see here in terms of calling that a golden spike or the start of the Anthropocene was that there was no potential marker, or at least that particular event was observed to happen at different times in different locations. So there was no golden spike. Likewise, for farming, there was none. Diachronous means that you see the effects of these changes at different parts of the geological record at different times, right? So none of these previous older Anthropocene potential events was seen by the people that were looking into it as being something that you might want to call a golden spike. So what happened was there's a bunch of geologists in the Subcommission on Quaternary Stratigraphy. That's the thing in the middle here in this plot on the left-hand side. In 2009, they set up a subgroup, the Anthropocene Working Group, and they charged them with coming up with evidence for or against the recommendation that the Anthropocene be denoted as a new epoch in the geological timescale. And so they turned it off. And you can see there was quite the hierarchy here. There's the Anthropocene Working Group was part of the Subcommission on Quaternary Stratigraphy, which is part of the International Commission on Stratigraphy, which is part of the International Union of Geological Sciences. Okay, so it's sort of slow down in the food chain, if you will. But they turned it away, and for 9 years, essentially, well, yeah, 2009 to 2016, so 7 years, they worked on gathering evidence. And that subgroup had a vote in 2016. And they voted on two questions, and those are on the right-hand side here. Should the Anthropocene be treated as a formal chronostratigraphic unit defined by GSSP? And the second question, should the primary guide for the base of the Anthropocene be one of the stratigraphic signals around the mid-20th century of the Common Era? I'm going to come back to that in just a little bit. And you can see that in 2016, 29 of 33 members of the Anthropocene Working Group voted for calling where we are now a new geological era. Okay, so what happened since then? Since then, the geologists, if you want to have some sort of a new era defined, you need what geologists would call a golden spike. You need a record that distinctly shows in the geological record some sort of a transition, a change from one period to the other. And so workers trundled off and looked all around, and they found a place called Crawford Lake, which is either close to Toronto or Hamilton, depending on whether you like big cities or smaller cities. It's in Eastern Canada. And if you look at the geological record from that lake, you'll find in this picture, for instance, on the all the way to the right is a sediment core taken from the bottom of the lake. It shows very nicely striated sediment layers in that core. And just after 1950, what you'll see here on the left-hand side are two markers, if you will. The blue one is carbon-14. That comes from bomb detonations, atmospheric bomb tests after the end of the Second World War. And you can see on the red curve in the middle, that's plutonium-239 and plutonium-240, which both also come from bomb tests, atmospheric bomb tests. You can also have written the half-lives of these elements, or these isotopes below them. So carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,700 years. Plutonium-239 has a half-life of 24,100 years. 240 has a half-life of 6,550 years. So these elements are going to be in the geological record distinctly for an awful long time. And that was one of the criteria set for defining a new era, whether there is a global scale long-term record in the geological record for these things, and you can see that there is. Now, why didn't this get turned into a geological epoch? One of the counter arguments by a couple of the members of that Anthropocene Working Group, in particular, one was Bill Redeman, was that the Anthropocene, or at least the human influence on the planet, started far earlier than 1950, which was the proposed Golden Spike Day. And these plots here come from a publication of Redeman's in 2007. And I want to take them up because I find the arguments to be really not convincing, and I'll tell you why. So what the core of the argument starts off on the left-hand two plots here. And what Ruddiman did was he looked at, on the top plot, A is observed methane concentrations from ice cores and solar radiation. And then what he said was that the natural methane trend should follow solar radiation. It didn't really give any good evidence for why that might be the case, but you can see the blue curve is what Ruddiman assumes methane would have done in the absence of human activity. And you can see that trend, the expected trend, or Ruddiman's expected trend, goes downwards. Likewise, plot B shows carbon dioxide concentrations. And here you can see that carbon dioxide concentrations about 12,000 years ago started decreasing a little bit till about 8,000 years ago, and then they started to increase after that. And Ruddiman says that the natural carbon dioxide trend would have continued downwards. That's that blue line, right? And would have reached about 40 parts per million of carbon dioxide by the start of the Industrial Revolution, just because of early anthropogenic influence on the planet. And then finally, if you look up here and see, Ruddiman says, here's the observed climate in terms of temperature. That's this reddish curve, right? And that temperature would have continued to decrease and gone back into a greenhouse, glacial state, had humans not been involved. But that I find really problematic, because why would you start your natural CO2 trend there? What I've done in the last plot here, the lower right, is I've extended the carbon dioxide record backwards in time to about 15,000 years back in time. And here you can see, and I put Ruddiman's arrow, the same arrow that you see in plot B, on this curve. And this is the same data that Ruddiman was using as well. So why would you choose that particular point to start your natural CO2 trend? Right? This is the data, and if you can extend it further and backwards. So what's the natural trend here? I don't know. Might be slightly increasing over that time. So I find the argumentation for this early Anthropocene to be quite problematic. And in fact, it gets even more problematic. So on the right-hand side here, one of the things that Ruddiman maintained was that the world was cooling down, and then humans started to do things like have agriculture and domesticate animals, and that stopped the cooling trend. And the evidence that some of the evidence for that he presents was coming from sources like this. This is a publication looking at temperature anomalies from the 1961 to 1990 period. That's the curve on the right. And you can see that in this particular set of records, there was a peak around 7,500 years ago in temperature, and then there appears to be a cooling going down to pre-industrial times, right? And then boom, very quick warming due to our activities. But Ruddiman would say that this particular cooling should have continued. Nature says that would have continued into another ice age, was the main point of his argument, had humans not started manipulating their environment all the way back here. Well, as it turns out, that particular record it contained artifacts. And this is the latest record for temperature. This is an anomaly again from the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago to essentially pre-industrial conditions. And you can see here that in this latest record, which, by the way, was endorsed by Marcotte and Chacun, who are the people that produced this record, basically they wrote a companion paper in Nature that was published along with this one that says, toss our reconstruction, use this one instead. This is better. So it's kind of an endorsement here. But then you don't see that cooling. In fact, from the start of the Holocene here, you see that temperature had been very, very, very slightly increasing, almost constant, but very slightly increasing at the time. So the basis for the early Anthropocene arguments aren't all that scientific, at least not in my opinion. Okay, so now what's happened? Earlier this year, there was the Subcommission on Quaternary Stratigraphy had a vote, and they voted 12 members against and four for the proposal to call this new epoch the Anthropocene, give it an epoch name. Now that vote is being challenged because it wasn't called by the chairman or one of the vice chairs of the committee. So there seems to be some sort of procedural anomalies in that vote itself. So something's going on there that I don't know about. There was some talk about calling the Anthropocene an event rather than an epoch. That's kind of like and that I'm not sure that there might be a difference without any distinction in that. But the reasoning, again, for that I've read about why some of the members of this committee voted against that proposal was that humans impacted the planet long before 1950. But we've seen in the scientific evidence that yes, those impacts occurred, but they did not have a distinct stratigraphical record behind them, and they weren't global in scale. Okay, so the scientific evidence does not support that particular counter argument. So I would support this statement by one of the members that voted for the committee or voted for the proposition that we all know the planet has entered a period in which humans active is a key force and left indisputable stratigraphic evidences. So I share that opinion, and now I'm going to turn this over to Christina. Together with Alistair, we wrote a reflection, a blog, an opinion piece about why that particular decision we thought was not a particularly good one. And I'll stop there, stop sharing my screen, and mute myself. Over to you, Christina.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kevin, for helping us to understand the background of this current name-giving problem, because I think that is one of the really important matters here, that this name-giving problem and the procedures kind of within geology for finding golden spikes and naming epochs doesn't really shouldn't be interpreted, because there's a high risk that this will be interpreted as if the climate change and the movement of materia across the planet at an unprecedented pace, as well as the great acceleration, it is there, it is actually happening. So it's important to underline that this is a name-giving problem, and not that it's evidence for that the Anthropocene effects are not there kind of with us, because I think most researchers agree on that the Anthropocene as a phenomena still exists. And the challenge here, I suppose, I feel as an archaeologist, the name giving of different periods or processes and things like that, it's a question for debate. Looking at kind of archaeological evidence, the kind of processes kind of leading up to modernization, etc., can be said to have really sort of long roots where people have related kind of differently to the environment kind of over time, where domestication of cattle also meant that you altered the kind of human-animal kind of relationship. And what you can sort of feel and sort of see is that the Anthropocene as a phenomena is a kind of cascade effect of lots of small little kind of changes going on around the Earth that kind of coincided in the kind of great acceleration. So from an archaeological viewpoint, of course, the Anthropocene as the great accelerations may have kind of deep roots, but that doesn't contradict that we can actually see it more clearly in the stratigraphical record right now. And the first point there that I really wanted to make is that the name-giving problem doesn't take away the problematic situation that we are in. And I heard on Radio P1 today in Vetenskapsradion, Peter Sögaard Jörgensen was mentioning this as news. And I really, really hope that this news aren't kind of taken up as a complete dissing of the Anthropocene phenomena as such. Because people keep moving more materials across the planet than volcanoes, rivers, etc. kind of does. That is a fact. But it's also a time philosophical question on how something can actually be sort of pinpointed in time. And I think sort of looking at kind of geology's kind of procedures of actually wanting to find that particular kind of golden spike and the layer that kind of can be identified kind of across the globe is one way of kind of relating to time. And there are, of course, lots of other ways of looking at it. And going back to this point that the phenomena of the Anthropocene, this thing that we have global warming, that we have species depletion, we have extinctions kind of going on, and there are unequal questions about who is actually suffering most damage kind of in this horrible predicament that we are in that the apocalypse has actually already kind of hit poorer people in poorer areas. I think it's important that we sort of hold on to that is actually going on. And I think also the term the Anthropocene has gained lots of traction in other subjects. I'm a humanities scholar, for example, and there the Anthropocene has been what you could say a productive concept, where many people have sort of written long kind of papers about the naming of the Anthropocene and the problematics that kind of lies behind it. For example, you have a kind of spin-off of these kind of discussions in the naming of the Capitalocene that Andreas Malm and Hornborg has written quite a lot about. And they're saying that we can't leave it at a problem where it's kind of a joint kind of human agency that has affected climate and species depletion, but you also need to attribute this change to an economic system and this idea of having constant and increasing kind of growth. So they have kind of picked up on the kind of fossil fuel dependencies of modern economic systems, and they have wanted to kind of move the discussion to add something called the Capitalocene to actually look at the kind of system behind climate change. And the Anthropocene has also, as a concept and the phenomena, driven other versions of this. There's been the neologism of the Plantationocene, where other scholars that have expertise in colonialism, capitalism, and they're looking at kind of hierarchies around people, are talking about the Anthropocene as driven by a plantation mindset in the way that you can extract resources and you can behave in very hierarchical ways among people, and that this is also an aspect kind of driving the Anthropocene. So they have kind of opened up the concept as it is a productive concept that has kind of transposed itself into other kind of studies, for example, in anthropology and humanities disciplines in general. And then within the environmental humanities and in kind of humanities kind of post-humanism, Donna Haraway, who is a great scholar in multi-species studies, for example, she has said that we need to rethink this period completely and question many different thought structures that we kind of carry with us. And she has, in a playful academic mood, wanted to talk about the Anthropocene as the Cthulhucene. And here she borrows a name from a spider somewhere in a South American kind of desert. And in naming the Anthropocene, the Holocene. She wants to kind of challenge our thought structures about human exceptionalism. And she says that we need to kind of rethink what a human is, and to rethink sort of the human relationships to kind of ecologies, our surroundings, and who are we actually accountable to. And in doing this, she wants to challenge and change our knowledge production. And she says that we need to go through transformations, both in kind of practices and in our kind of thinking. And hence, she wants to make the Anthropocene as thin as possible, to try to actually change and alter our thinking practices and our practices. And we really don't want to get kind of rid of this anthropos in the Anthropocene, and try to and evolve ourselves kind of into multi-species thinking, into thinking about sort of what relations do we actually need to give time to. And that spins on to other kind of time philosophies, where a dear friend of mine, Michel Bastian at Edinburgh University, has started to talk about time not as these kind of linear curves that we are looking at here, or in the kind of stratigraphical sense that I, as an archaeologist, feel very, very familiar with. But he's talking also about time as relational, in the way that we need to kind of self-reflect on what actually we give time to. What do we give care time to, for example? She talks about time as hierarchical, in the way that we have so many processes now today that needs to be kind of synchronized kind of through time. For example, the taxi driver need to sit and wait for the businesswoman's schedule to kind of click in for the taxi driver to actually do his or her business. So time is always kind of relational and hierarchical. And what Michel Bastian, as a time philosopher, tells us is that we need to start thinking about sort of what we actually give care and repair time to. And I think sort of that type of time philosophical argument is important also when we're looking back at this dismissal of the Anthropocene as an epoch. We can sort of feed back into this discussion that it is a really productive concept that has helped many scholars and many people to kind of rethink the human's position in the environment, and to rethink and try to kind of reconfigure where we're actually heading. So that I finish my input kind of to your talk there.
Thank you very much. Now I will stop the recording.